The ARVAX relay flared at 4 o'clock UTC. For most of the galaxy, that channel was ceremonial, an artifact from the First Accord era. It had not pulsed in centuries. When it did, only 3 possibilities followed: surrender, evacuation, or extinction. The message itself was short. 11 fleets aligned under the Galactic Council's Central Command had voted on enforcement proceedings. Earth's expansion into unratified sectors, particularly the Telsin stratum and the 3 disputed fold anchors, was deemed a breach of Treaty Clause 9. The ultimatum? Stand down all colonial infrastructure, cease expansion, and surrender all outer arc transit records within 96 hours, or face planetary-level enforcement action. The message concluded with the Council's sigil, flashing red across every diplomatic node Earth still held. The colonies received it instantly. Not one broadcasted it. No government official made a speech. No global emergency bulletin was pushed to the surface. There was no scramble to evacuate outer colonies or rush military formations to defensive orbit. In fact, not a single civilian transmission acknowledged the message at all. Instead, deep beneath the Kaltari Ridge, in a subterranean decision vault maintained solely by the Strategic Continuity Office, a dormant command string flickered awake. No ceremony, no activation ceremony, just one voice verification, one cold breath, and one phrase. Directive Upsilon, engage full schema, authorization, Vox. Commander Tharan Vox was in orbital latency storage. Not stasis, just silence. He had not been deployed in 4 years, not since the Resolution Summits had concluded and Earth had officially removed its name from the Concordant Defense Ledger. He had served then as Earth's liaison to the security mesh, one of the last Terrans permitted to interact with Council Warthink architectures without legal escort. Most the Hissus, ought he'd retired. In truth, he'd been archived, held on ice, not for peace but for timing. That timing had just arrived. Vox was revived within 6 minutes. When he opened his eyes, his pulse was already regulated, not from drugs, from protocol. The briefing was embedded in his neural overlay before he spoke a word. The moment he blinked twice in sequence, the transfer initialized. He said nothing to the chamber technicians. They weren't trained to speak to him anyway. Instead, Vox stood, removed the surgical fiber lines from his spine, and walked barefoot across the hardened transit floor. The lift to orbital platform Vega took exactly 91 seconds. At minute 12, Earth replied. Not with negotiation, not with rhetoric, not with diplomacy. The message to the Galactic Council consisted of 37 data packets, each precisely time-stamped and delivered to Council command infrastructure at mirrored nodal intervals. The contents were not inflammatory. In fact, they were terrifyingly neutral. Complete fleet telemetry for all 11 Council formations, positions, propulsion cycles, fuel drift, even active load balancing across AI combat processors was submitted without encryption. The packets included rotating schematic models with predictive variance trees accurate to within 0.02% of their real-time movement paths. There were no threats, just clarity. Council diplomats, still reviewing the draft speech for Earth's expected appeal, froze. The packet timestamps were undeniable. Earth had gathered the data before the ultimatum was issued. Some of it dated back 2 weeks. Initial reactions ranged from stunned confusion to procedural fury. The Virex representative demanded a security breach investigation. The Hethari envoy claimed Earth had intercepted the ultimatum prematurely. Others insisted the ARVAX relay must have been compromised, but the relay was clean. What they failed to grasp, what the diplomatic analysts took far too long to understand, was that Earth hadn't intercepted anything. This wasn't a leak, it was a gesture, a reply formed not out of panic, but out of completion. Earth didn't respond because it was threatened. It responded because the conditions it had modeled had finally arrived, and that meant the script could proceed. While the Council demanded explanations, Earth's own planetary systems remained eerily quiet. Civilian life went on uninterrupted. Traffic in the Pacific Exoport flowed normally. No fleets launched. No public figures made appearances. There were no banners, no speeches, no war drills. The only observable activity occurred at orbital platform Vega, where Vox stood before a rotating starfield with a hand resting on the command altar, his eyes closed, lips unmoving. He wasn't transmitting. He was synchronizing. Directive Upsilon was never a defense command. It had no weapon arrays, no fleet activation protocols. It wasn't a line of code for counterattack. It was a signal harmonics schema, an architecture for control, not of ships or weapons, but of systems. It had been designed for the day Earth would no longer need to fire a single shot to end a war. It merely needed to know how others moved, and once it did, everything else became choreography. The telemetry packets were only the opening step, a declaration, not of war, but of ownership, not of territory, but of understanding. And so the clock, intended to terrify Earth, ticked uselessly. 96 hours were supposed to pressure Earth into groveling. Instead, 12 minutes was all Earth needed, not to prepare, not to threaten, to reply with command. As Council strategists pored over the data, trying to determine whether Earth had access to inside sources or hidden relays, Vox opened his eyes. His voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet. "They have given us time." The technician nearest him blinked. "Sir?" Vox didn't look at him. "And they're not going to enjoy how we use it." Revek Hahn had catalogued anomalies for most of his professional cycle. His post within the Council's Central Archival Division wasn't considered glamorous, but it was stable, clean, structured, free of the politics that turned higher seats into backrooms of veiled threats and ceremonial rage. His role was simpler: sort data, flag discrepancies, audit inputs, confirm integrity. Until now, the job had felt like counting breaths on a sleeping planet. Quiet, necessary, predictable. But today, nothing aligned. Not the timestamps, not the telemetry, not the origin points. The data Earth had sent shouldn't have existed. The first assumption, naturally, was that the humans had intercepted Council communications in real time. That would have been bold, even audacious. It would have required an array of cloaked eavesdropping mechanisms, signal interception, quantum decryption layers. Nothing beyond theoretical reach, but certainly beyond Council tolerance. Revek ran the intrusion audits himself. Nothing. No breach signatures, no untagged access points, no violation of protected transmission corridors. Earth had not listened in. It had predicted. Every positional shift, every course correction, every load redistribution inside Council fleet cores had been gathered before the fleets launched. 2 weeks prior, to be exact. A full 9 days before any member of the Council had voted to draft the ultimatum. Revek reran the sync logs. The timestamps checked out. The models Earth submitted weren't guesses. They matched real telemetry to a level of fidelity that made Revek nauseous. No AI the Council possessed could map that many chaotic systems across that much spatial drift and get it that precise, not without surveillance, not without taps. Except Earth hadn't needed taps. They had Project Overture. It hadn't been public. Even now, its name only appeared in metadata trails embedded within the structure of the data packets. Revek saw it first as an offhand note embedded in the transmission lattice, overture/comp sub.h-sync. A file name, most likely. Then he dug deeper. It wasn't a file. It was a schema, a design system, a complete harmonics engine built to listen not for content, but for behavior. Here was the part Revek couldn't explain to the tribunal when they asked later. The Council's beacons, those elegant, polished pulses of synchronization broadcast across millions of light years, were designed for trust. They assumed any party receiving the signal understood the rules. Beacons synced velocity, heading, drift correction, and AI loop patterns for cooperative maneuvering. To Revek's species and to most others, the beacon array was a marvel of civilization, a gesture of shared space. To Earth it had been a fingerprint, and fingerprints could be reverse-modeled. Project Overture didn't decode messages. It never had to. It wasn't interested in the encrypted content at all. It only tracked noise, specifically the harmonic residue left behind during pulse synchronization. That residue, meaningless to most, carried entropy patterns. Tiny fluctuations in beacon latency, barely perceptible, unique to each ship's current AI stress load, thermal regulation, and spatial churn. No Council fleet sanitized it. Why would they? No one had ever weaponized background sync noise. Until Earth. While the Council saw symmetry and order in its beacon system, Earth saw variation. Those variations weren't random. They were behavioral. Rivek found one packet labeled Variant Delta 13 Hollow, a model file cross-referencing fleet turnaround decisions with entropy spike signatures detected from previous cycles. Earth had compiled years of unsent messages, mapped stress drift against disease on timing, and modeled probable escalation responses with near-perfect accuracy. Rivek pulled the audit logs on the ultimatum itself, specifically the Council floor chatter, the flagged concern reports, the pre-drafting notices. Every verbal hesitation, every policy pause, every shift in fleet patrol protocol. Earth had anticipated it. The humans hadn't intercepted Council command. They'd simulated it, not through espionage, through pattern collapse modeling, through silence, through watching every twitch the Council made and teaching its algorithms to whisper back the likely future before it happened. Rivek stood from his station. His bones ached, his fronds stiff from inactivity. A message flickered across his secondary display. Directive flag, Tier 1 oversight request. Explain Earth's predictive advantage. He didn't answer right away. How do you explain to an empire that it had trained its own demise? He turned back to the file lattice. Project Overture wasn't merely a response system. It was a mirror, polished not to reflect image, but to reflect intention. Earth had charted the small decisions, the vote delays, the late beacon pings, the subtle delays in overlapping enforcement orders, and assembled a behavioral lattice of the Council's escalation ladder. The worst part? Overture wasn't even invasive. There was no rule against signal observation. Earth had simply obeyed protocol. But while the Council had transmitted trust, Earth had studied timing. While others issued ultimatums, Earth had watched the tremors before the breath. Across the galactic quadrant, similar findings were surfacing. The Tracken Observer Corps flagged Earth simulations as potentially sentient. The Vizari tacticians argued for a reclassification of Earth's analytic core as mimetic threat class entities. Some wanted war, others wanted retreat. But Earth had already spoken, with data, and that data had done more than unsettle the fleet commanders. It had exposed a brutal, unspoken truth, one that Rivek couldn't ignore even if he tried. The Council hadn't been compromised. It had been understood. Jan Vekros had spent his life archiving failure. As a military code historian within the Council's Department of Systems Integrity, his role wasn't to write history, but to exhume it, cataloging every strategic collapse, every logic flaw, every war that spiraled from some unnoticed protocol misalignment buried deep in the crust of forgotten versions. He'd studied everything from the Cray decentralization breach to the Tyrus cascade loops. He could quote firmware rollbacks the way other scholars quoted scripture. He had seen sabotage, seen accidents, seen wars born of carelessness. He had never seen this. The beacon collapse, 32 synchronized signal platforms gone dark in a single pulse event, had originally been flagged as a multi-system cascade. But deeper analysis revealed the truth. They hadn't been damaged. They had been turned off. Command deauthorization signals were accepted across every node. No breach, no force, just a clean internal override. And every single one of those platforms ran fleet coordination firmware based on a single architectural model, the Ithar Standard Logic Stack, which, as the records confirmed, had been stabilized not by Council engineers, but by a neutral consultancy Earth had provided 5 decades earlier, not during war, not even during conflict, but in the diplomatic cleanup after the Ithar scission, when the galaxy had flirted with collapse over AI ethical standards and trust chain violations. The Council had been desperate then. Fleet systems had begun rejecting human input due to self-reinforcing logic trees, AIs refusing contradictory orders and locking out their own command staff. Earth had not yet ascended to strategic parity. They had no fleets of their own large enough to threaten doctrine. What they did have was a logic core model, clean, predictive, self-heal, being they called it cradle logic. It wasn't elegant, but it worked, and it worked in chaos. Back then, the offer had been simple. Earth would share cradle logic for free. No licensing, no delay. Just sign a data equivalence clause, allowing Earth to audit for interoperability. They'd signed. All of them. Jan sat at his console, the old archived contracts glowing on his retina display. The language was dated but clear. Earth had been given permission to audit firmware integrity for the safety of fleet operations. That clause had never been revoked. Worse, the patch instructions weren't optional. They were built directly into the AI compliance libraries. Most fleets had never updated beyond those patches. They had formed the foundation of every major navigational routine in the quadrant. What Earth had done wasn't sabotage. It wasn't even clever. It was meticulous. And it was old. The override signals that collapsed the beacons had not bypassed security. They had flowed through it. They had entered as diagnostic commands, using verification structures Earth itself had authored, structures still tagged as system-level safe by every major fleet AI in existence. Vekros pulled up a sample log from a decommissioned test node. He followed the diagnostic trail backward. 3 subroutines branched cleanly from a failsafe that had been labeled in Council codebooks as Cradle Heart Call. That name had not raised concern at the time. It sounded like a medical subroutine, perhaps a life support stabilizer. But it wasn't. It was a recall key. A simple command structure designed to reinitialize a beacon's priority logic tree to factory defaults. Defaults which Earth had defined. Defaults that included deference to Earth-issued diagnostic authority when flagged under specific conditions, rapid synchronization loss, triple-loop echo irregularities, or multi-vector acceleration conflict, all of which Earth had intentionally induced in the hours leading up to the transmission. It was a backdoor. Not hidden, not malicious, documented, approved, ignored. Earth hadn't exploited a weakness. They had used the Council's own apathy. In the decades since peace had been assumed, no one had re-audited the trust chains Earth built. No one had questioned why a small, politically marginalized planet had been so eager to give away clean, scalable AI logic for free. And no one had noticed the diagnostic branches those logics left open. Jan leaned back in his seat and stared at the ceiling. His chest felt hollow, not from fear, he was used to fear, but from a cold, echoing certainty that the past had never belonged to the Council in the first place. Every beacon, every maneuvering AI, every navigation core, each one was speaking a dialect Earth had taught them to forget they'd learned. Vox hadn't needed to hack anything. He had simply spoken in the system's native tongue, and the system, loyal and rule-bound and blind to context, had obeyed. That was the horror. Not that Earth had lied, but that they had never needed to. Council leadership convened privately, demanding technical explanations, fail-safes, assurances. Vekros had none to give. There were no countermeasures, no patches, because there had never been a breach. There was only authority, calmly exercised by the one species who had written the instructions everyone else had chosen to stop reading. Earth had authored the manual, and the galaxy had signed every page. Admiral Kren Volmar had never trusted the Council. Not during the Concordant Pact ratifications, not during the Scission mediation, and certainly not now. He considered their structure a festering illusion, 12 empires pretending to collaborate while each clawed quietly behind the curtains. The Virex Dominion had always held itself apart, independent, proud, efficient. They were fleet-born, bred in orbital bastions and memory-linked from birth to the Dominion's archives. Protocols were sacrosanct. Orders mattered. Sovereignty was their spine. So when the ultimatum to Earth was issued, and Earth responded not with excuses or surrender, but with an avalanche of precision data, Volmar had bristled, not at Earth, but at the Council's response. The others stalled, debated, whispered about anomalies and diagnostics and ancient code buried in the firmware like some digital ghost story. Volmar didn't believe in ghosts. He believed in ships, shields, pressure seals, and the principle that no species, no matter how clever, could manipulate reality once metal met orbit. He mobilized his fleet without seeking approval. 5 capital ships, 13 escort cruisers, and a hull-break carrier, all launched silently from Bastion Virex. They weren't ordered to attack. Volmar wasn't suicidal, but he would enter the exclusion zone. He would pierce the buffer Earth so confidently maintained. If Earth truly had nothing to hide, it would flinch. If Earth had something to fear, they would strike. Either way, Volmar would make contact. The Council protested, of course, quietly, cautiously. No one dared issue a retraction or public rebuke. The Virex were too powerful, too vital to the outer corridor enforcement. So the fleet departed, engines cold, weapons locked, but primed. Earth did nothing. No scrambling of interceptors, no orbit shuffles, no diplomatic flags, not even a transmission. The Dominion fleet crossed the exclusion threshold at the 10-hour mark. The silence was unnerving. Volmar stood at the command dais of the Argent Edge, his flagship, reviewing local telemetry. Earth's orbital patterning was static. No ships repositioned, no satellites activated. The planetary defense grid didn't so much as flicker. It felt to him like stepping into a room where someone had been talking about you only to stop the moment you walked in. But he didn't hesitate. The Virex did not bluff, and they certainly didn't retreat, because the air felt strange. At hour 13, Argent Edge crossed into Earth's orbital shadow. That was when it arrived. A priority override ping, silent, immediate, and unforgeable, appeared in the Central Command AI's cognition tree. The message was simple: a ceasefire directive authenticated through Virex command hierarchy, bearing the Dominion's own encryption lattice and signed by Fleet Law Marshal Rin Vetas. It cited Article 9 of the Virex Engagement Doctrine: no military force shall advance under contested legality if a mirrored order of de-escalation exists with authenticated prior timestamp. Volmar stared at it. The order was perfect, real, except it wasn't. He had issued no such request. Vetas was in cryo-rotation back on Bastion, and yet the order was flawless. Time-stamped to 1 day before launch, its digital signature verified against the Virex command tree, not hacked, not mimicked, recorded. The order had been inserted during the last software refresh before fleet ignition, when all ships underwent standard compliance check-in for outer theater deployment. Volmar knew the process, knew it like breath, and now, if he chose to continue, he would be violating his own chain of command. Virex law was clear. To disobey a verified ceasefire, regardless of suspected manipulation, was cause for tribunal dissolution of rank. And worse, it risked fragmenting the Dominion's hard-earned political neutrality. He paced. There was no threat from Earth, no weapons locked, no fleets en route. Just this order, sitting in his command lattice like a seed that had waited years to bloom. He reviewed the security logs. The signature had passed every verification protocol, which meant only one possibility: it had been placed before the final deployment during the AI audit phase. That phase had included one external compatibility suite, a harmonics calibration provided by Earth. Years ago, during a minor trade protocol update, the Council had mandated for cross-species fleet standards. A quiet, peacekeeping upgrade. A patch. A handshake. Earth had written that handshake. Volmar stood silently at the center of the bridge. Around him, officers avoided his gaze. Every man on that ship knew what was happening, even if they couldn't say it aloud. This was a trap, not one sprung in anger, but in timing. Earth had known he would come, not through prophecy or prediction, through law, through pattern, through a patient exploitation of every rule the galaxy had layered over itself in the name of stability. Volmar could resist, could order the override, accept the consequences, and burn his way toward Earth's upper atmosphere. But that would make him small. It would make him predictable, and worst of all, it would prove Earth's point. Instead, he gave a single nod. The AI registered his motion, protocol triggered. His stasis chamber opened. Volmar stepped inside. As it sealed around him, the Dominion fleet halted, mid-glide, mid-breath, a frozen formation staring at a planet that had not moved once since the day began. They came with fire, and were answered with silence. The kind of silence that rewrites doctrine. By hour 30, the council hall no longer carried the sound of confidence. It was supposed to be a chamber of order, 12 species seated beneath the great vault of the Concordant, their decisions carved into law before the echoes of their voices had faded. The structure had endured empires, crushed rebellions, and arbitrated extinction. It had always been decisive. Until Earth, until now. Speaker Dralveth presided from the central elevation, his voice clipped and unamplified. He had dispensed with ceremony. There was no anthem, no preamble, just the bitter scrape of chairs adjusting and the growing hum of defensive rhetoric. The hall's ambient lighting remained dim, sensor-linked to cognitive strain, and tonight it dipped further than it had in generations. The kind of strain that came from realizing something ancient and foundational had been missed. "Begin proceedings," Veth said. The seats were full. Every delegate had arrived, all but one, Earth's. Not that it surprised anyone. Earth had sent no representative, submitted no briefing, provided no response to the tribunal summons. They had in fact acknowledged nothing since the Virex fleet stopped cold. No speech, no protest, no explanation, just the ghostly stillness of a world too calm to be cornered. The silence, however, was not the issue. The problem was deeper, buried beneath every encryption standard, beneath every systems protocol, beneath the very architecture the Council used to function. Every attempt to isolate Earth from control had failed. The override disruptions hadn't been stopped. They had simply obeyed older laws. Earth's laws. Logic the Council had signed into place, then forgotten. Councillor Myrick stood, his tone sharpened from the hours of fruitless legal gymnastics. "We cannot allow this to stand. A member species has usurped control of Council-critical infrastructure and refused to answer for it. Silence must not shield them from consequence." He paused, letting his claws tap once on the glass podium. "If Earth believes its past contributions exempt it from oversight, then we must formally revoke all privileges of access and proceed to enforcement under Clause 31. Several delegates stirred, a few nodded, but the nods were uncertain, less support than habit. The Virex violation had shaken more than nerves. It had shattered assumptions. No missiles, no sabotage, just a forged order, validated by Virex's own law and signed with its own encryption key. They had walked into a net woven from their own history. Councillor Jend of the Harkai Collective raised a weary hand. "And how exactly do you propose we enforce that, Myrick? The moment we issue a new protocol, any new instruction, we validate the old chain Earth built. We confirm the SAS, a dominance with every failed command we try to send." Myrick didn't reply. He didn't have to. That was the trap. Enforcement required systems. Systems required logic. And logic, somehow, impossibly, belonged to Earth. Speaker Veth leaned forward. "There is precedent," he said softly. The room fell still. When a species reaches an infrastructural parity with Council frameworks, when it becomes essential to system function rather than subordinate to it, a reclassification may be considered. Silence followed. Delegates exchanged uncertain glances. The word no one wanted to say hung in the air like a trigger. Protocol sovereign. It was not a title of honor, nor of elevation. It was a resignation, a legal acknowledgement that the Council's enforcement tools could not apply without risking systemic collapse. Only once in recorded history had the designation been used, and the result had been seclusion, fear, and eventual extinction of the classified party, consumed by its own containment. To label Earth Protocol sovereign would mean never ordering it again, never auditing, never punishing, never ruling. It would mean surrender, without admitting it aloud. Mirek tried once more. If we assign this status, we lose our last measure of deterrence. Earth becomes an exception. That breaks the chain. Veth looked down at the table of artifacts, old ceremonial sigils representing logic thresholds and security interlocks carved in gold and enameled crystal. No, he said. It shows us the chain was broken long ago. We're just now reading the damage. The vote was quiet. One by one, each species placed their mark. No public speeches, no accusations, just a resignation scratched into the bones of the law they thought they controlled. Unanimous. Protocol. Sovereign status granted. Veth closed his tablet. Strike the ultimatum from the permanent record. Reclassify the transmission as a failed diagnostic test of the ARVAX relay under stress load latency. Mirek's voice cracked. That's a lie. Veth met his gaze. It's mercy. For all of us. The hall emptied slowly. Some walked as if under gravity fatigue, others in practiced silence. The council left not as rulers, but as witnesses to a power they could no longer contain. And Earth? Earth said nothing, because they didn't need to. They had written the sentence long before the court ever convened. Len Vorin was not a soldier, nor a diplomat. He did not sit on tribunals or write doctrine. He worked in the archive, a cathedral of cold silence buried beneath the council's inner sanctum. His job was simple: verify the end of things. Before any resolution was sealed into history, it passed through Vorin's hands. He did not interpret, he confirmed. In a galaxy built on fragile consensus, truth still needed someone to read it. It was just past the 38th hour when the final transmission arrived. There was no fanfare, no ping, no urgency tag. A single file lodged itself quietly into the Tier 1 inbound node, flagged only for validation. It did not route through diplomatic channels. It did not pass through intelligence filters. It bypassed them all. Vorin saw the source tag. Earth, Orbital Node Vega, User ID, Tharen Vox. He paused. The tribunal had closed hours earlier. Earth had never shown. No representative had ever spoken. And yet now, this. A submission not to argue, not to retract, but to document, as if it were Earth's turn to write the footnote beneath the council's signature. Vorin opened the file. It was the ultimatum. The original one, the council's final draft, in full, every line, every conditional phrase, every coded escalation marker, including versions that had never been transmitted. Vorin blinked. There were 4 variations of the document, each dated before the actual vote, drafts that only existed in closed delegate sessions and encrypted prep work folders. The timestamps were impossible. Earth had received the ultimatum 8 hours just before it was written. He ran a redundancy check. The metadata was clear, not tampered with. The version history matched the council's internal model tree, right down to the discarded phrasing from Councillor Mirek's original language on enforcement clarity. Impossible. He moved to the attached index. It was a simulation log. An AI model Earth had apparently been running for several months. It didn't predict troop movement. It didn't chart fleet vectors. It modeled speech, patterns of stress, common linguistic structures, moral fallback behaviors, mapped across each delegate, cross-referenced against treaty histories, cultural guilt indexes, and escalation tolerances. It had flagged, with eerie precision, the exact sequence of emotional positions each delegate would take once pressured. Earth's system didn't wait to hear the ultimatum. It had anticipated the kind of beings who would write it. The simulation didn't need access to internal memos. It had modeled them from tone, hesitation, and the very language the Council had used during past negotiations. The closing line of the predicted draft had been only 3 words off from the actual one issued. And that was what broke Vorin's breath. The payload ended not with an argument nor an explanation. Just a message in the header, embedded like a postscript the system never had to say aloud. We don't intercept ultimatums, we intercept intentions. He read it twice. No threats, no demands, no victory cry. Just the quiet implication that Earth had never been reacting. They had always been watching the shape of thinking itself. He called no one. Not yet. Instead, Vorin forwarded the payload to the deep log servers. No edit, no note. Just a direct archive, sealed by level 0 redundancy, locked against modification. He marked the file Final Behavior Echo, a tag he'd only used once before when the Drellic hive turned in on it. Self in perfect algorithmic recursion and vanished into dust. At the outer ring of the chamber, the young page, barely more than a student, approached with a quiet step. "Sir, should we update the Earth threat profile?" Vorin didn't turn. He simply closed the interface and whispered, "No." The boy hesitated. "Then what do we do?" Vorin's hand hovered over the Global Cognitive Index, where Earth's prediction model interface sat blinking, awaiting update clearance. He selected it and deactivated monitoring. Across the archive's nested systems, Earth's analysis tree dimmed, its subroutines halted, predictive pulses silenced. Not as an act of aggression, not as punishment, but in reverence. Because the galaxy had learned what it truly feared. Not Earth's weapons, not Earth's defiance, but that Earth had never needed either. They had only needed to understand you better than you understood yourself. And they had, quietly, completely. Now there was nothing left to say, so they said nothing. And that silence, perfectly timed, was how they won. If the power to end wars lies not in weapons, but in understanding your enemy better than they understand themselves, then what happens when you are the one being understood? Was Earth right to use silence as a weapon, or did they cross a line no empire should? Comment below. Should other species fear Earth, or learn from them? And if you want more gripping HFY tales, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications.